Hello, and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Dagster offers a new approach to building and running data platforms and data pipelines. It is an open-source, cloud-native orchestrator for the whole development lifecycle, with integrated lineage and observability, a declarative programming model, and best-in-class testability. Your team can get up and running in minutes thanks to Dagster Cloud, an enterprise-class hosted solution that offers serverless and hybrid deployments, enhanced security, and on-demand ephemeral test deployments. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Dagster today to get started, and your first 30 days are free. Data lakes are notoriously complex. For data engineers who battle to build and scale high-quality data workflows on the data lake, Starburst powers petabyte-scale SQL analytics fast, at a fraction of the cost of traditional methods, so that you can meet all of your data needs, ranging from AI to data applications to complete analytics. Trusted by teams of all sizes, including Comcast and DoorDash, Starburst is a data lake analytics platform that delivers the adaptability and flexibility a lakehouse ecosystem promises. And Starburst does all of this on an open architecture, with first-class support for Apache Iceberg, Delta Lake, and Hoodie, so you always maintain ownership of your data. Want to see Starburst in action? Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/starburst and get $500 in credits to try Starburst Galaxy today, the easiest and fastest way to get started using Trino. Your host is Tobias Macey, and today I'd like to welcome Pete Hunt to talk about the launch of Dagster Plus and how that's going to help level up your data platform and orchestration across languages. So, Pete, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hey, thanks, Tobias. I'm Pete Hunt. I'm the CEO here at Dagster Labs.
And do you remember how you first got started working in data?
Yeah, well, if you want to go way back, I got a master's in distributed systems, and that was really about big data back when I was doing it. So a lot of, back then, like Hadoop was getting really popular, and MapReduce was the state of the art for how things were done. So I would say that was my first taste of it. I went on to kind of work at Facebook for a while, where I didn't actually do much with data. But I fell in love with dev tools and open source, was a founding member of the React.js team over there, and then eventually left and found my way back to large scale distributed systems and data. I was co-founder of a startup that did trust and safety as a service. So we would ingest a bunch of event data from social networks and marketplaces, and we would basically try to find bad guys on the internet. And so this would be spam accounts, hacked accounts, those sorts of things. And it was a lot of real-time stream processing with Kafka, a lot of orchestrating, the training and productionization of machine learning models, and a lot of unsupervised anomaly detection using someone's intuition to create a heuristic. The real world of this stuff is pretty messy. And just really fell in love with it. We sold it to Twitter, and I managed some data teams there, and I've been working there in the space ever since.
For folks who want to dig a bit deeper into Dagster specifically, we've done a number of episodes about that, so I'll add links in the show notes. But for the focus of today, you're getting ready to launch the new Dagster Plus service. I'm wondering if you can just start by giving a bit of an overview about what is the focus of Dagster Plus as a product, what's the story behind how this came to be, and sort of the concepts that are core to this product launch.
Yeah, so Dagster Plus is kind of everything that you need to build a productive and scalable data platform for your organization with Dagster at its core. I'll kind of dig into that. That sounds a little like marketing-y, and I try to be clear, but at the same time, that's really is descriptive of what we're trying to do. Let's start with what Dagster is all about, because Dagster is at the core of this thing, and how we talk to customers and users understood where the gaps were and what we were seeing kind of in the macro trends, and then how we responded to it with Dagster Plus. So Dagster is this open source project. It's been around for a long time, and we kind of play in this data orchestration category. So traditionally, data orchestration is the main framework that you use to build your data pipelines. It schedules them. It makes sure that they run on time, that if they fail, they get retried. And if the retries hit a certain limit, you page the on-call and those sorts of things. And what we kind of started the project originally because there were a lot of complaints around developer experience with existing solutions. So there's a category of challenges with those systems that they're just not kind of designed with modern software engineering best practices in mind. So they require every team to have, share a single Python environment, for example. So you get into fights over whether Pydantic 1 or Pydantic 2 is the one true way that we're going to develop. Or they don't support local development and testing very well, because in order to kind of create a true multi-tenant environment, you have to orchestrate a bunch of Kubernetes jobs and stuff like that. So anyway, there's this category of a lot of the existing orchestration solutions were like didn't have a great developer experience. So we started Dagster to kind of get at that problem, and it went pretty well. And one of the key things that we figured out that was important for delivering a good developer experience was getting the programming model right. It actually did take a couple swings for us to get there, but we did finally get there. And we settled on this kind of thing that we call software-defined assets, which is the way I would kind of describe it is Dagster is an open source, and Dagster Plus are both asset-oriented orchestrators, asset-oriented tools. Whereas if you were to use something like Airflow or Prefect or one of these other tools, they're very workflow-oriented. It's right on the website. They're workflow engines. They do a good job at that. But what we kind of started to realize as we were tackling this developer experience challenge was that asset orientation was really important, and it made a lot of things really easier. So first of all, the mental model for developing data pipelines was much clearer, right? You kind of write your code in a declarative way, you go asset by asset, and it becomes very easy for you to say, hey, for this given asset that my data consumer is asking questions about, how do I get from that to the code that produced it? If you develop in an asset-oriented way, very easy to make that leap. You develop in a workflow-oriented style, you have to map this world of your data assets and the lineage separately from your workflows that produce and consume them. And you end up in these situations where it can be hard to figure out which workflow or which step in the workflow produced or consumed the asset. If you have multiple workflows depending on a single upstream asset, you often end up either over materializing it to keep it like too fresh, which can create a bunch of problems around cost, or you construct these like kind of interlocking kind of fragile cron expressions where if your one pipeline gets or one workflow gets slow, the other one doesn't get the data in time. So there was like a lot of problems with this workflow oriented style, and we didn't even realize it at the time. But as we started to zoom out and take a look at other problems that users were facing in the space, and they started to get louder around 2022. So 2022 kind of, interest rates went up, tech kind of started leaving this boom era and went into this kind of quieter, more economically challenging environment. And a lot of data teams started to realize that these giant market maps of like millions of modern data stack tools that they are buying and integrating together, it was not sustainable. And we kind of had this asset oriented orchestrator, and we were talking to our customers about their challenges with kind of the explosion of complexity in the stack. And what we realized was a lot of our customers that were feeling the pain the most, or a lot of the users, that we were talking to that felt the pain the most, were actually not Dagster users yet. And they were trying to struggle with this impedance mismatch between building workflows in something like Airflow and trying to map those to asset-oriented tools like Fivetran or like DBT. DBT calls them models, but like we would argue that their models and assets are very comparable concepts. And you had every tool in the data stack, whether it was looking at metadata or whether it was doing data transformation or data movement, it all fundamentally dealt in terms of data assets. And then mapping those into this workflow paradigm was very painful, and it required a lot of different point solutions to be manually integrated. And so that's what really gave us the idea to kind of go after Dagster Plus as our strategy moving forward. I just want to pause there and see if that kind of makes sense. I know I talked a lot.
Yeah, no, that makes good sense. And to the point of asset-oriented versus workflow-oriented, I know that in the initial formulation of Dagster, it was very much focused on that we're going to string together a bunch of tasks, and under the covers, it actually still does that to a certain extent, but that you're able to intelligently understand what are the different subcomponents or what are the different outputs of the steps beyond just the macro of I have this big batch of things. And in terms of the juxtaposition of Dagster open source and Dagster Plus, and also Dagster Cloud, which is your current paid offering, I'm just wondering if you can give a bit of an overview about what that Venn diagram looks like and some of the new capabilities that you're hoping to address in Dagster Plus, and some of the ways that that is intended to focus on this aspect of complexity and multiple points of integration.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. A great question. So, first of all, Dagster Plus is the next evolution of Dagster Cloud. So, Dagster Cloud name going away. It's going to be called Dagster Plus now. And the reason for that is the original formulation of Dagster Cloud was it's hosted Dagster, number one. So it's less infrastructure to manage, or in the case of serverless, no infrastructure to manage. Had some kind of enterprise features around security, auditing, access control, role-based, fine-grained roles, that kind of thing. And had some developer quality of life improvements like branch deployments, which would kind of let you fork your data platform for every pull request and have a really nice and slick SDLC. And that was pretty much it for Dagster Cloud. Dagster Plus has grown a lot more features and capabilities, and really is not just an orchestrator anymore, at least in the traditional definition. We like to say that we're kind of trying to evolve the category a little bit and kind of reposition where the integrations need to be, and basically kind of like with assets at its core, like the stack starts to look a little bit different. Is kind of what I'm trying to get at. So Dagster Plus specifically, I could rattle off a list of features, but like we have the asset graph at its core. And so we talk to customers, we say, what are some of the things that you want to do with that? Or some of the questions that you want to answer? Because oftentimes these are around observability, right? And so they say, we need to understand our Snowflake spend or our BigQuery spend or our S3 spend. And the way that they do that today is the data platform team goes out to all of their partners and customers and says, we need you to tag all your resources. And they tell you that they're going to get to it in 3 quarters from now. And so in the meantime, data platform team gets a call from finance, every couple of months and says, hey, can you go like figure out why we're spending too much money on so-and-so tool? And so what we're able to do, because the orchestrator runs all the compute, it knows all the different services that your individual assets are talking to. And we also know kind of the different teams associated with the assets and everything like that. We can attribute the spend on those different third-party services or first-party services to the data asset itself. That becomes really powerful, right? Because teams can now kind of manage their own spend. The central data platform team can look at the platform holistically and start to identify trends. And you can do all this without like this big project of like, again, tagging the resources in AWS, building the connectors to something like Datadog, and like paying Datadog, by the way. And also like keeping those up to date, because a lot of times what we would hear that like customers would do a spike on that, like, once a year, every 18 months, and it would work for a while. And then they would, buy another company or spin up a new effort or something, and they would have to repeat that work again. And oftentimes the teams would forget that. So attributing cost and spend and resource utilization, we have a capability called Dagster Insights that leverages all the metadata and logs that the orchestrator is the source of truth on, and like kind of activates that for customers and gives them that capability. So everything else in Dagster Plus is like a flavor of that, right? Like I guess, Tobias, do you have any questions about cost, or should I go on to the other kind of things that we're doing with Dagster Plus?
No specific questions, but it's definitely, as you said, a very important element of the problem, and also one that does require a lot of focus and detail to do well and get right. And when you're talking about money, getting it right is obviously paramount. So
Yeah, definitely. And so again, we only build stuff in Dagster Plus that takes advantage of Dagster Core's unique architecture and differentiators, right? So like, again, like a workflow engine, you can't really necessarily attribute the spend to, if you attribute it to a task, like that is helpful, but again, your stakeholders are coming in, they don't know anything about tasks. Tasks often might be like co-owned by like 6 different teams, depending on what they do. And the data asset is a much cleaner way to do that. And second, we've kind of spent a lot of time on developer experience in Dagster Core, and we have this resources system that kind of abstracts away interactions with external systems. And so what we're able to do is kind of inject additional metadata as part of those integrations that we maintain. So like, if you're using DBT and Snowflake, for example, you just like flip a switch and now you've got a comprehensive cloud cost management solution, which is, again, it's like building on these layers of abstraction that we set up a while ago. So that's felt pretty cool. The second thing that we're doing for Dagster Plus is we've got a really awesome data catalog that we've been working on for a while. And so if you've used Dagster before, I know, Tobias, you've used it. We're this asset-oriented orchestrator. We have a view of all the data assets that we call the asset catalog in Dagster. And we've called it that for a long time. And we were talking to users, and when they said, hey, this thing is like really close to all we need for an for a data catalog, but it's not quite there. And part of it was missing some features. And so we've built some of that. So like a good example is we now have DBT column level lineage, in the Dagster Plus data catalog now, and the metadata in the open source version. The other thing is the information architecture was like all wrong. And so we had all this cool information that they wanted to get access to, but the stuff that we put front and center was what data platform teams care about. So like the materialization history, what like resources it was using, execution time over the last week, that kind of thing. And what people actually wanted was like, they wanted to like, see the schema and like see a description and have that be the most of the top things in the UI. So a lot of this was just reorganizing the UI and doing some user research and talking to customers. And so we've now got this thing into a place where, by the way, open source has gotten a lot of these improvements too. So the open source data catalog is much better than it used to be. And now it's kind of suitable for being, if the majority of your data platform is in Dagster, you probably don't need a separate data catalog. If it's, if you're using a data catalog as like in a thing that's sucking in metadata from a bunch of different systems, we don't have like a big connector library that does that. But, we think that centralizing on Dagster, again, in this asset-oriented way, produces a lot of productivity benefits, and like you should get a data catalog for free for doing that. And then in Plus, it's just, it's a leveled up data catalog specifically around search and discovery. So again, Dagster Plus is kind of all the stuff that you need to build a scalable and productive data platform for your organization. Data discovery is really important. And so we have a lot of multiplayer features and a totally different search experience in Dagster Plus that is like, I think way better than open source. And it's kind of hard to build a search experience in open source anyway, because it requires custom infrastructure and like lots of iterating on ranking and stuff like that. So
absolutely. And in the launch announcement for Dagster Plus, there are a few different bullet points that you lay out, taking them in turns. There's making data a team sport, delivering reliable, high-quality data that the organization can trust, observing and managing data platform costs, and mastering the heterogeneous collection of technologies. And you've addressed some of those, in particular, the cost aspect, the reliability and observability aspect. One of the interesting pieces there too, and I think they play off of each other, is making it a team sport and being able to work across the different platform components, and in particular across language barriers, where up until now Dagster has largely been single player mode of, if you write Python, then great. If you don't write Python, well, then just write some Python. And I know that with the Dagster pipes feature, you're branching beyond that a bit more. I'm wondering if you can talk to the heterogeneous aspect of the data environment and some of the ways that you're thinking to move beyond this Python as the be-all end-all of the orchestration definition and the execution context, and how that enables the team sport element of being able to collaborate across a wider group of individuals and teams.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but like asset orientation is really key here. And so I want to maybe tell you how multi-language support would work in in like more of a workflow oriented world. I bet a lot of listeners, if they built a data pipeline, they probably have this CI/CD pipeline that builds a Docker container, and they have some cron job or Airflow task or something else that spins it up and runs it somewhere, right? And if they want to be able to observe that, or they want to be able to model that in their data catalog. Each of those is like a separate integration, right? And so in this asset-oriented world, the default should be to get asset lineage data out of this thing and all the appropriate metadata. And so what we heard from a lot of customers was they were building these they were writing a lot of Python that would spin up their Docker container or Kubernetes job or whatever, or and like run it. And then they would kind of find a way to communicate with that thing and then like log the asset data back using Dagster's Python APIs. And so we basically took that pattern and built a protocol around it that we call Dagster pipes. And this is a protocol that supports pluggable transport mechanisms. So there's like a sub-process launcher for this thing. There's a Kubernetes launcher. There's a Databricks launcher. And there's a local Docker one, I think, too. And it kind of just like communicates with a very basic like JSON protocol. And it passes, execution metadata from Dagster to your sub-process that says, hey, this is the partition range that we are materializing today. Here's a bunch of other information about the run. And then that custom code written in whatever language you want to use, running in whatever environment you want to do, as long as we have a way of getting a JSON payload back, we have a couple of different transports to do that. It'll tell you, hey, here's all my metadata. Here's the trace of my execution. Here's like whether I succeeded or failed, and a lot of stuff like that. And so we have a reference implementation for that in Python, obviously. So if you want to take kind of the Kubernetes jobs that you're currently orchestrating in Airflow, for example, and like port those over to the system, it's very, very simple. And we also have prototypes and things in languages like Rust. And we've also got an internal one, I think, in TypeScript too. You are starting to see these kind of AI native practitioners, I'm going to call them, that are actually writing like data jobs in JavaScript. And so we think that having a language independent protocol for asset oriented orchestration is like really important. And so that's what Pipes is all about.
And as a brief digression, one of the interesting thought exercises is trying to decide what does it mean for something to actually be a data asset versus just a step in a graph. And I'm wondering, what are some of the kind of philosophical ways that you have tried to make that ideology concrete and help people navigate that question as they're designing their pipelines of when does it become an asset and when is it just a step in the production of that asset?
Yeah, we think the default should be asset, but that's not a super helpful framing of this answer. But what I will say is, first of all, there should be like a manifestation of the asset somewhere. So it like here's something that's not an asset, right? Like sending a notification or sending an email, that is clearly like a side effect that like happens in the world, and that is probably not an asset. But if you are taking a bucket of bytes and storing them somewhere, that is probably an asset. Because if you think about it, if you're like kind of have some durable state somewhere, you probably want to have some metadata about it. Other folks in the organization will probably want to depend on it. And you'll probably want to have some SLAs and policies around, hey, how often do we refresh this thing? How often is too often, and how often is not often enough? So we've got a lot of features in Dagster Core, which is our open source version, and Dagster Plus that support that. So, broadly, I think of like, if you're storing data in a system, that is probably a data asset.
Yeah, I agree there. And where it really starts to get tricky is I just need to dump this thing into an S3 bucket somewhere to be able to pass it off to another thing. Do I call that an asset, or is that intermediate state that should just be hidden somewhere? And I think ultimately it doesn't hurt to treat it as an asset because maybe there is some other downstream use of that intermediate state that is useful in somebody else's context.
Yeah, it certainly, you can have kind of fatter or skinnier assets depending on, I think I've just noticed that different teams like kind of put more or less, they do like more of a micro asset or a larger asset approach. Please, God, let's not use those terms. But I think you're right that sometimes it can be a little unclear, but erring on the side of modeling them as assets is, I think, the safe option. And, just previewing like a little bit of where we're going to go, one thing that we've been talking about, we want to get it right, is this notion of like public versus private assets. So that intermediate S3 file, like for your team, you actually might want to really visualize that and like have multiple things that depend on that intermediate S3 file. But you probably don't want some external team like taking a dependency on that, because that's an implementation detail that they shouldn't be aware of. And so what we're kind of working on later this year, that's not going to be part of the Dagster Plus launch, is this notion of, different teams and which assets are visible to which teams and what are considered public and which ones are considered private.
To throw some more buzzwords in there, which ones are a data product and are the boundaries of your data mesh?
Well, yeah, yeah, we can talk about data mesh. It's always funny because we always, like, whenever we say the words data mesh internally, like somebody always laughs, and then we end up having, like, I don't know, it's very buzzwordy, but it's also like a thing that people are actually doing. I like to call it like data decentralization, but really what it's about, I guess I don't actually know. Does anyone really know what data mesh means? But the way I see it anyways, this balance between certain facets of the data platform are best managed by a central team, and other aspects are best decentralized and managed by separate product areas or whatever. And really dialing in that balance is like pretty tough. But if you can get it right, it can unlock a ton of productivity. But it kind of harkens back to the old microservices versus monolith debate at the end of the day. Right?
Absolutely.
So,
ultimately, it all boils down to Conway's law.
Yeah, exactly. That is totally true. And I'm working on a presentation for Data Council right now, and I'm not sure if I'm gonna put this slide in there or not, but kind of like overlaying making the case for why the asset graph is so important, like overlaying the asset graph with the org chart and showing that kind of like your graph of data dependencies often represents the team boundaries within your organization. And it's important to like be able to visualize them and maintain them explicitly in a system of record.
And that also brings us more into the multiplayer mode aspect of the data orchestrator and the capabilities of the data platform, and your note of the public versus private assets and what are the visibility boundaries of those different assets. I'm wondering if you can just dig a bit more into what it means for the data orchestrator to be an enabling force for this multiplayer and data collaboration requirement across an organization and across those different organizational boundaries.
Yeah, so I'll start with what we've got today, and today being everything that we've built in Dagster Core so far, and then the Dagster Plus launch, and then maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about the roadmap that hasn't quite landed yet. But in terms of what we've got today, one of the biggest enablers here is making your data assets or data products discoverable to the right stakeholders and helping them self-serve information about those data assets. It's like key to making this thing multiplayer. And kind of like, it seems like every single shop that we've talked to that has deployed a data catalog, they say like, yes, we need this, but like the data is always out of date and nobody ends up actually using it because they can't trust the data that's in these things. And like fundamentally that goes back to this impedance mismatch between workflows and the data catalog. So like you have to do this mapping between the workflows that are maintaining the data assets and the catalogs that are visualizing them. And if you don't constantly keep that up to date, the data catalog can fall out of date really easily. And then you're back to like the data help channel in Slack that is just people just asking questions all the time. And so Dagster Plus, we're really trying to get at that problem. So like we think that deep integration between the data catalog and the orchestrator makes a lot of sense because, again, the operational data is kind of the source of truth. The orchestrator is like the source of truth for the operational data that should be visualized in the data catalog. The second thing is like we think the programming model is just better for dealing with multiple teams. So, I can publish my data assets into this graph. Another team can depend on them. There's a clear contract between the consumer of the data asset and the producer of the data asset. This is in a workflow-oriented system. You don't have that clear contract, right? And so there's like kind of maybe a Google sheet somewhere that says, here's the S3 URL where the data will be, and I update it at 9 a.m. every morning. And then you read from it and you hope that it's updated, and maybe you run some assertions on the last modified time or something. But you don't have that explicit dependency graph between the two, and you can't have a team like go through and like Splunk and see like who is depending on, like, if I were to delete this data set, like what would break? And a lot of times teams just like, delete it and see what breaks, and then they restore it, and then they work with their teams. And like having that lineage is really, really important. In terms of where we're going with Dagster Plus, with respect to these multiplayer team sport type of features, we think that there is a lot of opportunity in governance. I've said the word data catalog a lot, and I'm really focusing on discoverability and observability, but a lot of folks really lean on the governance capabilities of their data catalogs. And so for us, we don't have any of that stuff yet, but I think there's a lot of exciting potential. So first of all, we've got the lineage. So the lineage of the data assets, as well as the column level lineage, if you're using a technology like dbt that supports that. And so we can kind of like write assertions about how personal data flows through the system, right? So a common question that we would get at my last job is like, the like Irish Data Protection Authority wants to know how you're using like their email, Irish, or EU citizen email addresses. And so answering that question without this type of infrastructure can be really challenging. But an asset-oriented orchestrator has all that information baked in, and we can start to like write assertions about saying, hey, if my upstream has personal data in it, all the downstreams by default will have personal data in it unless we explicitly opt out of those, right? So we can start to watch personal data flow through the system. And because we control the execution, we can actually write, again, this is more future stuff. We don't have this built yet, but like, you could imagine a world where we have data quality checks that examine the access control in the data itself, right? And actually refuse to refresh the pipeline. Like your downstreams will refuse to materialize if the upstreams do not have the right access control bits set wherever their data is stored. And so, but again, like this deep integration of the asset graph and the execution engine, or the data orchestrator, as we like to call it, like it just opens up this, like, dare I say, paradigm shift in how we build a lot of these things. A lot of things just become way easier when this impedance mismatch goes away.
To the point of the asset graph and the organizational boundaries and the visibility of the flow of data throughout these multiple stages, in the task-oriented view, typically the only amount of lineage you'll get is what is the specific dependency sequencing across these discrete tasks. But as soon as that terminal node completes, that's the last bit of visibility that you're going to get about that piece of data, unless you have this overarching system of the data catalog where you're adjusting all of the metadata and then reconstituting that visibility of how these boundaries propagate. Whereas with Dagster, presuming that it's all deployed under a single orchestrating node of the Dagster Web UI or Dagster Cloud, it doesn't matter what the actual task boundaries are as long as the metadata linkages for those assets are designed appropriately. Then you can actually see, regardless of what the specific task steps are, whatever those assets are, you can automatically view that dependency graph beyond the process boundaries and beyond the pipeline boundaries. And I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that you're seeing that change how data teams think about their organizational structures and their collaboration across the broader business context beyond just the core teams and their core responsibilities of the data assets that they're producing in the traditional task-oriented flow?
Yeah, that's really, really cool. And you also touched on something there that I think is really interesting too, or you danced right close to it, which is there's not a one-to-one relationship between data assets and tasks, right? Like you often see tasks, which is like a step in a workflow. If it's in the case of like dbt, it might materialize hundreds of tables, right? And I think one of the things that's like secret sauce to our implementation is that we can take these steps that do that and like subset them. So like, our engine understands how to like only materialize smaller subsets of the dbt graph in the event that that's what you want. I think there are other systems that kind of try to model dbt projects as like a graph of tasks, and you end up like with one task per model, and it's like super slow, and it's kind of painful to use. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. You asked about the ways that organizations change when they kind of adopt this approach, and like what we have seen is that at smaller shops, so let's say it's a 3-person data engineering shop, they like this asset orientation approach because it's just like at least a better developer experience. There's not much of an organization to transform, so like organizational transformation is not really like top of mind for them. But they like kind of writing code in a declarative style and being able to visualize it and observe it. For larger organizations, though, what we have found is that budgets have been not going up anymore. They're not really decreasing so much. They're more like they've been flat for the last couple of years. But there's the needs of the business have been increasing, and so there is like we have customers with like hundreds of seats, like data engineers embedded in every product team that are producing insights for their individual product areas. And there's more and more data available via APIs every single year, and they want more of it, and they want to be able to like make business decisions based on it. I mean, this is like a phenomenon that has been going on for 20 years, right? But still going on. And the stacks have been really complicated. And so they're really trying to empower those embedded data engineers within each product area to like self-serve as much as possible. And so again, there's this question of like, how much does the central data platform team, like what do they need to own versus what can they farm out to the individual product areas? And like, I think that there's this basic desire to, do the DevOps thing and give like as much autonomy to those embedded data engineers as possible. And that's great. It's harder than just doing that in practice, though, right? Because you have these compliance concerns that really often need to be solved by like a central team. There's infrastructure management challenges where you want to be able to take advantage of economies of scale. And so what we basically found with Dagster Core and Dagster Plus is there's one like Uber DAG of assets across the whole organization. So you get this like single pane of glass, top-down view of like all the metadata, all the freshness information, all the spend, subject to the access control that we have. And then in terms of like, you can chop up ownership of that graph and like give it to different teams. And because there's like a strict contract between the consumer of an asset and the producer of asset, that's something that you can do. And then where those actually execute, there's like this layer below, which we do have a workflow layer that sits below the asset oriented layer. It's just that we, most of the time people are writing code in the higher level. You can drop down into the underlying workflow engine, but we have this notion of this core architectural decision we made called that we call code locations. And the idea is that an asset can map, one or more assets can map to a single like underlying what we would call op, which Airflow would call a task. And that most of the time is like completely invisible to the user. They just write assets in a declarative style, but you can kind of like go into advanced mode and drop down into that layer. And then that op runs in something called a code location. And so you can kind of do that mapping however you want. And what we found is that smaller shops have one code location that does everything, like very monolithic approach. And then most shops are in the middle where they have a small number of code locations and like, multiple teams or multiple people contributing to a single code location. And a code location, by the way, is like, it's basically like a service that runs on Kubernetes that like runs all your code and speaks a gRPC protocol to the Dagster orchestrator and scheduler. And then what we are seeing is this really interesting thing where we're now seeing shops that do like hundreds of code locations. And they really are trying to like have every individual data engineer like run their own code location, be accountable for its runtime environment and all that stuff. And I tend to be a moderate in these situations. Like I'm like a macro services guy where like service oriented architecture is great, but you should have a smaller number of multi-tenant services. And so I think that the folks that are in the middle that have like, a code location per team kind of makes sense to me. I don't know, that was pretty technical, but is that kind of getting at what you were talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And digging more into that code location element and the reusability, the distributed versus centralized aspect, there are a lot of elements to that. And for my use case, for instance, I have a fairly small team, but we support a number of different product lines. And so I've been orienting the code locations around those different product lines, not necessarily around the team dynamics. And the reusability aspect comes in of some of those core platform elements, in particular the IO managers of I just want to be able to fetch and push files to object storage and be able to use those in the context of the workflow, or I want to be able to have some reusable logic around how a particular type of data element is processed for consistency and, to your point, compliance. And so being able to have that flexibility in terms of how those core primitives are composed into a given platform and deployment architecture has been very valuable.
Yeah. And I think it's another place where Conway's law can sneak in, right? Your structure of your code locations, it either kind of one starts to resemble the other over time, I think.
Absolutely. And in your reimagining of what Dagster Cloud is intended to provide and how this relaunch in the form of Dagster Plus is being conceived of and deployed, what are the core business and product goals that you're focused on addressing with this relaunch of your paid platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of focuses here. The first one is to enable data as a team sport with best in class developer experience and observability. So specifically, we have this feature called branch deployments. We've really leveled it up. We have basically like a branch deployments V2 that's coming out in Dagster Plus that it's already in the hands of design partners, and like we're getting a lot of really positive feedback about that. Branch deployments basically lets you fork your whole data platform for every pull request. So you don't have to like fight over staging environments anymore. You can kind of preview what this thing is going to do, run it. You can configure it to write new data assets into a staging area. Again, this is like another advantage of like an asset oriented approach versus a workflow oriented approach. And so we've really nailed, like, I think I can say with a straight face that we have like the best developer experience, or at least the most modern SDLC of any of the alternatives out there. The second one is really helping teams manage the costs of their data platform at scale. So this is Dagster Insights. By default, if you're using one of our official integrations, like our dbt integration, our Snowflake integration, BigQuery, OpenAI, you'll get cost information flowing in automatically with no work. And you'll be able to set alarms on it and like be able to attribute the spend to specific data assets and help you make the decisions about what to do about it. You can also use that to optimize your spend on our cloud product too, by the way. And so the third is, again, around this data catalog feature. We've really focused on leveling up the data catalog, both making it easier for data pipeline builders and data consumers, like business analysts, to use. And we've also really leveled up the data discovery feature. So we built a brand new search experience that is fundamentally multiplayer in nature. The last one is around data reliability. So we have a feature in Dagster called Dagster Core and Dagster Plus called asset checks. This is kind of, you can think of it as a way to model data quality checks in an asset native way. So for example, if you like import your DBT project into Dagster, that's a first class integration we have. All your DBT tests will show up as asset checks, and you can run them separately, and you can make orchestration decisions based on them. That's an open source feature, as well as a Dagster Plus feature. But with Plus, we are building on that a lot. So we have, again, integration with the insights feature, so you can start to kind of visualize, how your data quality is trending over time. And we're also shipping, built-in freshness checks. So taking a look at, the last time your data set was updated and making a decision about whether that is fresh enough. We talk to a lot of our customers. We say, hey, what are your biggest data quality challenges? Like freshness is like the biggest thing by a mile. And so we have a rules-based freshness capability that's coming out in Dagster Plus, where you can just say, hey, if this thing is older than 8 hours, like page me. And then we also have an unsupervised anomaly detection feature coming out in Dagster Plus as well, which we're very excited about.
And as you have been building and expanding on the core Dagster project and the paid services that you're building around that, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen those utilities used?
Well, one of the things that I really like about working in data is that it's so horizontal. And it's like every company in every domain uses data and has data engineers. And so my, like I was when I was like driving down the highway the other day, and I saw this big sign for Dave and Buster's, which is this like, it's like an arcade for adults. They serve like, like nachos and beer, and you play pinball or something. And I was talking to somebody about the company while we were passing by, and I was like, yeah, like data engineers are everywhere. And I was like, I bet Dave and Buster's even has data engineers. And I like went on LinkedIn, and I searched for data engineer Dave and Buster's. Like There was a whole data engineering team at Dave & Buster's, and it was like, you wouldn't think that a place that just like serves nachos and has like pinball machines would have a data engineering team, but they do. So they're not a customer, by the way. They're just a random company that I drove by on the highway. But you've got like companies like them building data pipelines. You've got Dagster customers that are launching rockets, that are doing drug discovery, that are making like large scale like fast food and consumer packaged goods. We've got energy companies using us, financial institutions. It's this whole like, oh yeah, and like trendy Silicon Valley tech companies too that do like social networking stuff. Like, it's really horizontal, and it's really cool that everybody is building. We're all doing the same stuff at the end of the day. You could take a data engineer from Dave & Buster's and put them, sit them next to a data engineer from someplace like SpaceX, and they'd have something to talk about. So I think that's really cool. We see that in the Dagster community, but frankly, it's not exclusive to us, right? It's like it's everywhere in the data community. It is interesting though, seeing how people push the system and organize their code in new and exciting ways that we didn't think of. The other day, we saw somebody. Well, we've just seen some interesting tech stacks. I'll leave it at that.
And in your work of guiding the direction of the company, working with your customers, working with the technologies involved, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process, and in particular in this lead up to the Dagster Plus launch?
That's a broad question. I think there are some tactical lessons that we're learning. Like, one key question for us is always, do we make this UI driven or do we make this code driven? I think that's a lesson. I think that's something that we're still dialing in. Most of our features in Dagster Plus are going to be UI driven, but a handful of them are quite code driven. So there's a question of like, how much do you make people scaffold up and have it be really flexible versus how easy do you make it? I think that, this might be a little bit like too transparent or whatever, but our last launch event was in, I think Q3 of last year. And that was a real hustle. We worked really, really hard, and it was really down to the wire. And this one, like, the features are all, for the most part, like, they've been with design partners and early access customers for a while. I don't think we're going to have any crunch this time, and we don't want to be a company that like relies on crunch in order to ship, right? Like, that's like, I'm all about kind of like we want to build a big, successful, sustainable company, and that requires like being sustainable in the way that we work, and crunch is not like a sustainable thing. So I'm very proud of like the team and the culture that we built, and how we've really, I think we have a steady launch this time, which has been great.
And for people who either are interested in Dagster and starting to adopt it, or people who've been using Dagster for a long time, what are the cases where Dagster Plus is the wrong choice?
The wrong choice. Well, I think if you're like very early, in your journey, right? So I think if you are writing your first line of code, and especially if you want to like, if you're a curious engineer and you want to stand up Postgres and you want to stand up a Kubernetes cluster and like own the whole stack end to end, I think that that's a very valuable exercise for individual engineers to do. Maybe not for every project, but like at least the first one or two times. You definitely want to use open source for that. We have, I think if you find yourself starting to get paged for infrastructure, or if you are finding that you have to integrate a lot of tools, because again, like, while Dagster Core is asset oriented, like if you want to do all of that cost management stuff or anomaly detection, or have a rich searchable data catalog for like your at scale teams, those are all going to be a lot of manual work, right? And so I think if you find yourself probably having more than one or two business stakeholders, you might want to consider going to cloud.
And as you continue to build on and expand the Dagster Core and Dagster Plus offerings, you've mentioned a few of the different things in the roadmap. I'm just wondering if there's anything else that you have planned for the near to medium term, or if there are any particular projects or problem areas that you're excited to explore and understand at a deeper level.
Like I said, I think that from the Dagster Plus perspective, we are going to double down on the areas that we've talked about. So we're going to continue to evolve and improve our data reliability offerings. We're going to probably introduce some kind of data governance capabilities towards the end of the year, that public-private assets thing, and understanding how PII is flowing in the system are two areas that we think are ripe for exploration. But I know we've talked a lot about Dagster Plus, but like Dagster Open is or Dagster Open Source, excuse me, is a huge priority for us too. And we're going to have a bunch of stuff landing there probably at the end of Q2, early Q3, and we'll probably do some comms around that. But a lot of work related to our core scheduling primitives is happening over there. So we have this auto materialization capability that we're working on leveling up right now. And so stay tuned on that. So, like I said, Dagster Core, our open source offering, it did benefit a lot from the Dagster Plus work, but we're kind of going to have some more open sourcey stuff landing end of Q2, early Q3.
Are there any other aspects of the Dagster Plus launch, the features that you're focused on shipping as part of that, and the ways that you're hoping to empower data teams as a result of those capabilities that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
The last note that I would just add is, and you had asked about open source versus Dagster Plus. Like open source versus Dagster Plus is not on-prem versus fully managed cloud. Like we have this cool architecture where you run an agent inside of, we have a hybrid on-prem deployment option for Dagster Cloud where you can run an agent in your infrastructure, and then we only exchange like metadata signals and some logs, but we don't actually see any secrets or personal data or anything like that. So what we found is that companies will come to us and say, hey, our security team will never approve a cloud service. Like we're just talking to you to learn a little bit more, but we're probably not going to go with you. And once they learn a little more about the architecture of our Dagster Plus, cloud service, they end up getting super comfortable with it because it's a very low risk thing. So that's the only thing that we didn't quite touch on was the underlying architecture.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you and your team are doing and to take part in the launch event, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes, and I'll add a link to the launch event there as well. And as the final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
Yeah, that's a great question. I had two candidates for that one. The first is, I had mentioned governance a lot. I still think that governance is a challenge, and nobody is happy with the status quo. Engineers aren't happy, the lawyers aren't happy. Nobody's happy with the state of data governance today. The second one is, I'm really excited for there to be a TypeScript for SQL. So something that brings modularity and type checking to the SQL query language. And DBT has taken some great steps in that direction. And has completely revolutionized how people do it. But I think that in front-end world, we saw this kind of move from string-based templating languages towards truly composable, statically typed modular systems. And I think we're going to see that in SQL world soon. So I'm very excited for that to happen.
And we are seeing that a little bit already with things like Prequel and Malloy. And I think really it becomes a matter of what is the adoption curve of these tools and what is the surface area that they're able to cover.
Yeah. There's a couple others too. There's SQL Mesh and SDF are other exciting projects in this space. There's not a winner yet, I don't think, but there's a lot of exciting innovation happening.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you and your team have been doing on the Dagster Plus product and the upcoming launch. It's definitely great to see the continued investment in the capabilities that you're offering to data engineers and data teams. So appreciate all the time and energy that you folks are putting into that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks, Tobias.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, Podcast.init, which covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.